cadence of the kettle boiling. At odd hours I would take the pages out and amend a slur, cross out an overindulgent ornament, shorten a rest I had made too long for drama's sake. I had reasons for secrecy that were not simply fear. I had learned in the slow, public way that instruments teach you that when a new piece meets the air for the first time, it is vulnerable to being described before it has a chance to perform. To be described in my present condition would be to expose it to a narrative that sought miracle or spectacle, a narrative that would take what was small and make of it either a headline or a token. In the months after the accident, the press had shown that it could do with my life what it did with orchestral scores: clip, rearrange, amplify for effect. I had no wish to see a private attempt turned into a commodity of pity. I wanted the fragment to be judged by its own modest terms. So I took the piece in trembling secrecy to Herr Baum. His apartment smelled exactly as I remembered: old paper and lemon oil, a faint residue of coffee from a cup that had been cooling for hours. The coat over his arm had the frayed neatness of someone who had never learned to value comfort over custom. He offered me bread in silence, which is a kind of welcome I had come to recognize. I played the fragment for him in the small wooden room that had once held the damp air of the conservatory's practice hall. He listened with the skill of a man who had spent a life training his attention to land where it mattered. There was no theatrical expression, no smile to give me false hope. He sat with his hands folded, his chin tucked in the pocket of his scarf, as if to shelter the sound. When I finished, there was a pause long enough for me to become uncertain whether the piece had failed entirely. Herr Baum cleared his throat, not for drama but to ordain speech to follow. "It's not a return," he said finally, which I took as both an observation and a mercy. "It doesn't try to be. That would be foolish and dishonest. It is modest. It has discipline." He tapped the music on his knee. "You have left room for silence in a way that asks the listener to work. That is better work than dazzling them into forgetfulness." The praise, delivered in that blunt fashion, carried more weight than any public ovation would have. Herr Baum's commendation was not about technical fireworks. It was about moral steadiness, about the refusal to pretend at a miracle. He spoke then of structure, of the way the motif should recur like an image in a portrait, not to remind but to deepen. He suggested excisions, a bar too ornamental here, a repeat too indulgent there. He spoke of the ending with an economy that made me feel both chastened and relieved. "And not with a flourish," he said, as if reciting some old law. "End with a question, a last note that is not closure but an invitation." I left his apartment with my manuscript in a thin envelope, and with something like permission to continue. Herr Baum's approval was not the absolution of the world. It was, rather, an authorization to proceed without spectacle. The next person I shared the piece with was the one whose pigments had first given me a road back, Leni. She had appeared at my flat that morning much as she had the first time, carrying a roll of primed board under one arm, and a tin of cheap brushes under the other. Her fingers bore the stains of recent work. She waved them as if to say business as usual. Anja, who had delivered her with a gentle glance and a list of errands, retreated into the kitchen and left us to our peculiar collaboration. I played the fragment for Leni as I had for Herr Baum, but I made a point of protecting the music from any problematic expectations. I asked her only to listen, not to paint, because I wanted to see what the music would produce in a mind that was not trained by critical language but by pigment and economy. Children have a way of listening that is uninflected by the forms adults assume. Their assent or refusal is immediate and not the product of a reputation to protect. Leni kept very still. Her dark eyes watched my hands. When the piece ended, she breathed as if she had been holding it inside her, and now needed to release some small part of it. She did not clap. She took from her satchel a narrow board the size of an open book and placed it on the floor. Instead of asking questions, she asked for colors. She painted while I played the fragment again. The first run-through was tentative. My hands were still discovering the muscle lines of the new phrases. Her brush moved fast, economy in motion, A wash of ash blue across the lower edge where my left hand had been, a narrow streak of iron red for the quick articulations, a thin veil of apricot that hovered over the cadential phrase. Each gesture was unmediated and precise as a decision in the middle of an argument. When the last note died, Leanie set down her brush and did not explain what she had done. Explanation with her would have been an unnecessary diplomatic act. We looked. The small board was alive the way only something made quickly and with conviction can be, not perfect but recognizing. I had the peculiar, private sensation of being seen. For all my conservatory training and public exposure, I had not been seen like that in years. Her painting did not restore color to my hearing. It did something else. It affirmed that the music communicated effectively to another sensibility, and that the connection between what I had written and what she had painted was immediate and intelligible. Lena's painting answered the motive as if it had always awaited that question. There was a practical moment after that, a negotiation of sorts. She wanted to keep one of the original pages, to study the rhythms as she had studied sound. I refused at first, oddly possessive, but I recognized the absurdity of possessiveness over accompaniment. We settled on a bargain. She could copy one page on an old bit of paper, and I would allow her to keep it. She accepted with a plain-faced happiness that undercut the complication of my adult anxieties. That evening, in the quiet that followed, I revised the fragment yet again. The revisions were small and literal, a shortening of a rest here, a tightening of a rhythmic figure there. I thought of her Baum's counsel to end on a question and of Lena's panel that had given my motive a face. The work of composition, I was relearning, is partly an apprenticeship in listening, not only to the sounds you make but to the reactions they provoke in others, and allowing those reactions to shape the piece without surrendering its core. Several images kept returning as I worked. One was the limp exactness of the empty concert hall after the accident, rows of chairs like teeth, stage lights held too bright and then suddenly dim. Another was Lena's small hands, stained and decisive, mixing paint in a cheap tin. A third was Herr Baum's face when he spoke of a question in the ending. These images did not settle into neat symbolism. They rearranged themselves as practical instructions. The manuscript itself became an object I treated with a protective thrift. I annotated margins in pencil, less pedantic here, trust silence, avoid grand gestures. I resisted ornament that I recognized as compensation. Those flourishes belonged to the old me, who had hoped to conjure color rather than form. The piece's language was lean, because that seemed to be what it asked for. It wanted an economy, as if the music had learned to speak through scarcity. In the final page I left a rest longer than felt comfortable, a rest that required the listener to hold breath and to imagine the phrase that followed. I obeyed her Baum and let the ending become an invitation. I sealed the pages in an envelope. To some that gesture would be theatrical. To me it was an act of care. I wrote on the front in my careful, practiced hand for Leanie and her Baum, for now. The for now was the small acknowledgement that everything is provisional, and that art, once made, asks to be carried into the world and judged and remade there. The envelope sat on my desk for 2 days. In that time I practiced the fragment until muscle memory made some of its lines less precarious. Repetition is a fortifying thing. It does not restore what was lost, but it makes new routes possible within the landscape of absence. I played for small private audiences for Sophia on a rainy afternoon, for Clara when she dropped by with bread, and a way of being quiet that felt like forgiveness. Each time I played, I watched faces more than I listened for color. Human faces have a different kind of synesthesia. They translate sound into micro-expressions that are, if you pay attention, as instructive as painted pigment. When I handed a copy of the manuscript to Leanie, she took it as if receiving something fragile. "Will you play it in front of more people?" she asked, suddenly serious in that way children can be. I did not answer at once. The temptation to test the piece publicly was real. The need to protect it was also real. The piece, in its modesty, seemed knave in the face of the world's appetite for spectacle. But Lena's earnestness had the peculiarly disarming effect of making me honest with myself. "Not yet," I said, "not for spectacle, perhaps in time, for a small room, for people who can listen as you do." She smiled, a small, quick curling of her mouth that made the world feel slightly less brittle. Later that night I polished the piano and sat with the instrument under lamplight, the apartment softened by the sort of absence that is not violent but present, the radiator's slow tick, a neighbor's late footsteps, the hush of the street beyond. I played the fragment one last time before putting it away. The ending, the place where her bomb had told me to leave the question, felt less like a refusal than like an opening. It was, perhaps, the only honest ending left to me. I do not pretend that this fragment is salvation. There is, in the months that followed, no miraculous reanimation of my former synesthetic world. But composition can be a modest theology, a way of reconstructing meaning by attending to what remains. The piece taught me that absence is not simply a vacuum, but also a field where new gestures can be planted if one does not mistake them for return. It gave me something practical to offer, a small currency with which to trade for encounters that might, in time, be more generous than pity. The chapter, then, closes with a decision that is both a protection and a promise. I sealed the manuscript in its envelope and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I left one page on the stand of the piano, not so that I might be tempted to perform it for anyone who happened to knock, but so that the music might live in the room where it had been born. Outside, the city carried on with indifferent loops of sound. Inside, the fragment sat like a patient thing, waiting to be invited into a life that would demand less of a miracle and more of an honest question. When I finally went to bed that night, I had the curious feeling of someone who had constructed a small, private raft, and having tested it, chosen not to set out into storm. The raft would remain available for a calm crossing. The next morning, I left a note for her bomb and folded a small sheet of paper into Lena's satchel, a map of the motif, a pencil sketch of the rhythm. I could not say whether the fragment would ever meet a public that was ready to listen. I could say, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had done the work I could do without pretending at restitution. That was enough for now. The last line I wrote on the manuscript before sealing it was not a flourish or a claim. It was a single word: listen. It was both instruction and invocation. There is an audacity, perhaps, in making a plea of such simplicity, but audaciousness is less a quality of composition than of survival. I slept with that small audacity in my pocket like a coin that might, sooner or later, buy something worth having. When morning came, the light across the desk caught the envelope's edge and threw a clean line onto the floor. The world, as always, offered no guarantees. What it offered, in that thin moment, was a narrow fact. I had written something true enough to be secret and generous enough to be shared. The story of whether that thing would become part of anyone's life beyond mine and Lena's and her bombs remained unwritten. That uncertainty, more than anything else, felt like a proper beginning. I kept a small notebook on the piano stand for a week, the sort of ledger I had once used to annotate phrasing in sonatas. Each morning, before Lena arrived, I wrote a single line: form, statement, departure, return. The act of writing it felt like fastening a strap across a loose sail. It was a way of promising myself that we would not drift amid improvisation. I did not yet know whether the strap would hold. I did know that language, however blunt, had to be the scaffolding for our work. Lenny came on a Wednesday that smelled of rain. She was already late. Anja had sent her with a brown paper bag of sandwiches, and a sour face that hovered at the door for a count of 2 before disappearing down the stairwell. Lena's hands were streaked with color, as always, a filigree of turquoise near the cuticle of her right thumb, a smudge of something like dried garnet on the heel of her palm. When she stood in the doorway, she looked at the upright piano as if it were some improbable animal, and I understood that she had not been taught to obey its rhythms. That was part of what I wanted to preserve. Today, I said, and for a moment my voice sounded like a metronome in my own ears. We will listen to a slow movement by Hayne. We shall look at form together, she nodded, chewing the corner of a sandwich. Form, she echoed as if tasting an unfamiliar word, like the shape of a story. Yes, like the shape of a story. First there is an idea, then the idea wanders, then it returns, changed. She made a small, thoughtful sound and padded across to the low stool I had bought for her from a second-hand shop. The palette I kept on the lid was a riot. Cheap tubes, rescued mid-century brushes, jars of water that had a clouded sheen. I mixed a slate blue, neither purely ultramarine nor complete gray, something that sat on the fence between cool and warm. I thought of the opening phrase, a clear, arching line, calm and certain, and handed her the brush. Blue for the opening, I said. But consider the edges. Not all blues are the same. Make the first phrase solid, then let it thin at the conclusion. Observe the breath. She began with a decisive stroke. Her elbow moved like someone who had done this all her life, a fast, economical gesture that left no questioning between intention and mark. The blue settled, then the brush lifted and she dipped again, adding a thin, almost red line for the phrase that rose. It was not what my memory of synesthesia would have prescribed. My old mapping might have urged apricot for that rise, but it had its own logic. Her blues held authority. We worked in small units. I would play a bar or a phrase. She would paint until that small passage felt embodied on canvas. I tried to use the vocabulary I trusted and practiced: motive, antecedent, consequent, development. I tried to translate musical architecture into words a child could grasp without overburdening the exercise. The words felt awkward at first. They had the liveliness of tools being rediscovered. When I play the motive again and again, I told her, notice what happens. Does it become less interesting or more insistent? Is there tension behind it? She looked up, mouth a little full of sandwich, then nodded. It gets hungrier, she said. Like when I draw the same house, and then something inside it wants to be different. Her language was rough-hewn but exact. Then you make it hungry on purpose. Sometimes. We make the ear wait or we make it chase. Both are ways to make meaning. There were moments of pure pedantry in my teaching, the sorts of microscopic cues I had once given students at the conservatory. Shift weight half a beat earlier. Breathe across the bar line. Let the right hand suspend as though holding a thought. Leanie would imitate each small gesture with surprising literalness, as if my instructions were a language she could wear until they felt like her own. She copied my half-beats and exaggerated silences in the same way a child might try on an adult's coat, obviously too long in the sleeve, but comforted by the suggestion of warmth. Yet there were also moments when my pedagogical certainty collapsed. I asked her, one day, to paint a development section, a passage where the opening idea should go through turbulence, be pulled apart and reassembled. Make the colors argue with one another, I said, wanting a visual equivalent to harmonic instability. She painted like a storm at first, slashes of indigo, thin veins of verdigris, a frantic streak of cadmium mixed with black. Then, 3 minutes in, she flung the brush down and began to cry, not loud, but the kind of sharp, astonished sob that belonged to disappointment rather than injury. She cried about her painting. It's rubbish, she said between puffs. It's like when I try to copy somebody and it comes out smooth, like I wasn't even me. I had not expected a child's dramatic dislike of imitation to land so hard. It opened a fissure in me. For years I had believed discipline to be a virtue because it was a way to control outcome. Lena's anger accused me. Was I training her to be a faithful but soulless translation machine? Or could structure and instinct coexist? I sat on the low stool and found that my hands were cold. Tell me why you think it's rubbish, I said quietly. She kicked at the palette with her heel and glowered. Because it's trying too hard. Because it's like homework. Because it's not greedy enough. Her words were a corrective. In my lessons I had been too much a conservator of form, too willing to translate every irregularity into an exercise. I had been teaching her the grammar of music without allowing for its colloquial, messy speech. The discovery humbled me not in the theatrical way of being humbled in public, but in the precise, narrow way that occupied a long afternoon space. From then on I altered the exercises. We still worked on phrasing and tension, But I began to insert intervals for improvisation, a bar where she could do anything she wished, an instruction to paint blindfolded, a request that she listen and not look. At first she treated these freedoms with suspicion, like a child given an unlocked jar for the first time. Then gradually the suspicion eased into delight. She learned to make a mud-colored smear that later resolved into a believable shadow. She discovered that a translucent wash could suggest memory rather than explicit sound. There were afternoons when Clara would appear without announcing herself, much beyond leaving a teacup on the rim of the piano and standing in the doorway. She watched with the reserve of someone who had seen many of my failures and a few of my successes. Her manners were always careful. She asked soft questions when she spoke. One such afternoon I asked Leanie to listen to a short phrase I had written specifically for her, a string of measures that bent, not towards technical difficulty, but toward a simple, human yearning. "What do you hear?" I asked when the last chord faded. She wiped her hands on her trousers and said after a moment, something like wanting to reach, but holding back. Like someone at a window who doesn't want to wake the house. Clara's expression softened. Something unspoken passed between us, as if she recognized the domestic weight of that image. "That's very good," she said. It was brief, but the praise mattered because it was not theatrical. It had the shape of a person reconciling a past intimacy with present caution. Leanie chose a narrow yellowed ochre for the phrase. It was not the bright apricot my memory might have liked, but it had the peculiar honesty of a color that had seen much daylight and kept its modesty. Later, when she varnished the panel, the ochre sat like a small, weathered coin. I found myself learning as much as teaching. I began to let go of the compulsion to align a color to a precise pitch label, and instead listened for the emotional architecture beneath the notes. In other words, I was translating in the other direction, not from my vanished synesthesia to art, but from the gestures of paint to the demands of sound. Lena's translations, at their best, supplied me with contours I had forgotten how to draw, a palette that suggested a crescendo not by hue but by saturation, a smear that suggested a retardando by its gradual thinning. Occasionally her balm would arrive. His presence had the stubborn gravitas of a solid object in a room, unadorned, necessary, slightly unsettling. He watched us one afternoon with his hands folded like a prayer. I played him a short passage and asked him to say nothing. He listened with the same modest attention he had once paid to my youthful experiments. Afterwards he pursed his lips, which is what he did when pleased. "Taste and patience," he said at last. "Not every sound must be decorated. Not every silence must be filled." The praise was small and practical, and yet strangely galvanizing. Baum's approval was a remnant of a world that valued endurance over spectacle. I had feared that my new methods, the barter with a child, the use of visual art as a guide, would amount to concession. His words suggested instead a continuity, that the fundamentals of attention were the same whether one used ear, eye, or hand. There was also the matter of language. Lena's first attempts to name what she heard were clumsy. She used bodily metaphors, pulling, squashing, breathing in. I tried to offer the technical vocabulary I thought useful: modulation, cadence, suspension. We invented a hybrid lexicon that sometimes felt ridiculous and sometimes uncannily precise. She referred to a sudden dissonance as an itch, and to a settled chord as a table you can put your cup on. Those images stayed with me longer than the formal terms. The sessions altered the flat subtly. The piano, which had been a precise instrument and a reliquary of loss, was now accompanied by panels leaning against the radiator. Small squares of varnished wood propped against stacks of scores. The panels gathered dust in a way that felt domestic and sane. On quiet nights I would look at them and try to read their palettes, as if they were music scores written in a different notation. In the mornings I would wake with a single color lingering at the edge of my vision like a remembered scent. Not all moments were gentle. There were times Leanie resisted structure outright. When I asked for economy, she produced luxuriant excess. When I requested a thin wash, she laid on pigment as if to declare war on faintness. Those defiant acts forced me into negotiations I had not expected to enjoy. For the first time since the accident, my aesthetic judgments were not merely commands, but questions to be answered by another will. There was a pleasure in being uncertain, a steadier sort of excitement. One exercise that delighted both of us was a reversal. I would ask Leanie to paint a short passage without seeing the instrument. She would put on a blindfold and listen while I played. Then, once the paint had dried, we would reverse positions, and I would play while looking at her panel, trying to match my touch to the shapes she had laid down. The blindfolding worked as a small ritual. It equalized authority for a few minutes and produced errors that were instructive. On one such reversal, she painted a diagonal wash of teal that I at first mistrusted. It felt like an evasion. When I played with the painting before me, attempting to supply the sound it suggested, I found myself drawn to a slow, syncopated rhythm I would not have thought to choose. The rhythm asked for room around it. It wanted silence as an ingredient. In the act of filling that space, I discovered a new patience in my own hands. These discoveries accumulated and fed one another. Lena's growing deliberate choices emboldened me to compose in small fragments again. I wrote short motifs inspired by her panels, a hesitant left-hand ostinato suggested by a repeated stippling of gray, a sudden bright chord inspired by a flash of cadmium yellow at the edge of a canvas. The pieces were modest in length, a few bars, stitched together like small confessions, but they had an integrity I would not have expected of the first efforts of a man who had been relearning how to listen. At the end of a long day, when the light in the room had thinned to the same color as one of Lena's ochres, Clara came and stood near the window. She had not entered the room during the lesson. She preferred to be present at the margins. She sipped the last of her tea and then, without ceremony, said, "You are changing the way you hear." It was not exactly praise, nor was it idle critique. It had the weight of someone who had watched me build and then burn my life and was now noting, without nostalgia, the outline of a different life. I did not know whether what we were doing could be called recovery. We were, at most, constructing a new grammar. There were days of regression and others of small surprises. Leanie learned to listen not merely for prominent gestures but for subtext. I learned to accept that translation could be partial, and that partiality did not equate to deceit. There was an ethical side to the work that I had not named. The idea that to ask another to inhabit your loss is to trust them, and to be trusted is itself a kind of restoration. Our sessions ended, as most of my days then did, with a quiet ritual. I would close the piano, and she would wipe her hands and sometimes hum a fragment she imagined while painting. The hum was not musical in any trained sense, but had the rightness of a person living with sound as a companion. Once when we were packing up, she looked at me with a seriousness that surprised me. "Will you teach me to play?" she asked. I had the impulse to answer with prudence, "Not yet, or when you are older." But the years of quiet practice and these thin, patient exchanges had softened something fearful in me. "Not yet," I said at first. Then I added, "But I can show you how to listen. And if you want, I can teach you how to place a hand on a piano so it doesn't hurt." She smiled widely, the sort of smile that announces an immediate plan. "Then start tomorrow," she said. The hook of the chapter is simple, domestic and stubborn, as Lena's attention acquires a grammar. My work shifts from trying to replicate an irretrievable interior map to learning how to ask another to help me chart the territory. The smallest instruments, a child's palette, a second-hand stool, a notebook on the piano, begin to feel like the necessary tools of an unassuming craft. We had not yet written the concert. We had not yet tested the method in public or against hostile scrutiny. But we had, in the privacy of a small room, begun to form a language. The question that would shape the months to come was whether that language could hold when the lights were on and the faces in the audience expected a miracle rather than a modest, honest translation. There are visits that arrive like a carefully tuned interval, not a crescendo, not a cadenza, but a plain cadence that says, in effect, we will resume in the same key. Clara's came like that, with a tray and a calendar, and a refusal to dramatize what had already been dramatized enough. When she knocked, the sound was a small punctuation in a day otherwise measured by the tick of the radio clock and the slow